The shapeshifter is one of the patron archetypes of contemporary culture, a purely self-defining, ever-morphing being. I want to look at a few examples of how this archetype manifests in popular culture, specifically cinema, and I will be summarizing the movies I discuss, so there will be spoilers. First, we can turn to the shapeshifter in mythology, and in particular to the Greek sea god Nereus or Proteus to get our bearings. In Homer's Odyssey and in the myth of Heracles, this shape-shifting lord of the waters provides the hero with knowledge if he can hold on to the god despite its many transformations. Keep your grip over the watery deity throughout the changes in shape, and you will pin it down into revealing to you its insights. From this, we can already extract the basic symbol. The waters of the sea or the mind, the ever-changing thoughts of the psyche or soul, can be held onto and observed throughout their changes without losing our own stability. We can tame the mind and learn to use it correctly for the sake of true knowledge. Heracles gripping Proteus is a symbol for meditation, in other words, for contemplative spiritual exercise, for calming the ever-changing mind. Now, mythology also presents us with the shape-shifting god as ruler over men rather than being overcome by men. We have the Slavic Veles and the Ixam people of South Africa's Ikagan, and Zeus himself, who takes all sorts of mostly animal forms to seduce human women. On one level, the symbolism here has to do with the divine taking on different forms as manifesting through those different forms, the divine being in all things. However, because the stories about Zeus, for example, have to do with disordered desire, God with human, animal with human, lust, violence, we should submit to Plato's assessment that these stories are not spiritually edifying accounts revealing deeper meaning, but are a sign of the degeneracy of Greek culture. We may add that this degeneracy consists of elevating the shapeshifter, the mental power and its ever-changing thoughts and appetites, to the level of the king of the gods. They mark an apostasy from true insight, from true metaphysics, and a sense of the transcendent, coming to worship the human psyche instead. The talented Mr. Ripley presents the best cinematic portrait of the shapeshifter archetype in many respects. Here we have the first scene in which Ripley displays his chameleon-like ability to imitate others for the first time. He's been sent by his employer, the father of a character called Dickie, to get his son, Dickie, to come home from Europe where he's been gallivanting around back to the United States.
Do an impression.
Now? The only talent my son has is for cashing his allowance.
What?
Oh, I like to sail. Believe me, I love to sail. Instead, I make boats.
Stop!
Other people sail them.
It's too much. You're making all the hairs on my neck stand up. I feel like he's here. Horrible, like the old bastard's here right now.
Good.
Marge, this is scary. You gotta hear this. Meet my father, Herbert Richard Greenleaf the First.
Pleasure to meet
It's significant that Ripley initially imitates Dickie's father and is in fact at this point secretly an agent of Dickie's father because the shapeshifter follows after pathological, excessively rigid authority. It's the opposite but also the natural conclusion, the post-modernity that comes after a materialistic modernity. Confusion and decline that comes after conquest and destruction. Ripley was initially an agent of the pathological masculine, the father, in bringing Dickie back to the United States. He was supposed to participate in this return, but he gives up on that. The initial attempt to return to the vitality of a culture that's already in decline by overcompensating through authority, politics, conquest, Caesarism, is now being followed by what we're calling the archetype of the shapeshifter, the anarchic after the authoritarian phase. And evidence of the fact that Dickie's father represents a pathological type of authority is that although he's very successful, he's very much the emperor figure, he's the captain of industry, he believes Ripley's lies about his son ultimately. And the faithful female that loved Dickie and who sees clearly that Ripley is the murderer is ignored. What we have here is that the true feminine is cast aside. Spoilt child, resented by its parent, creates a generational breach which can be filled by the shapeshifter. This is a pattern in cultural decline. Becoming erotically or romantically fixated with the character of Dickie, Ripley is, in truth, only falling for his own watery reflection.
Cole, can I get in?
No.
I didn't mean with you in it.
No, indeed, not with him in it, because Ripley will only ever unite with his own self, not with another. He eventually kills Dickie and throws his body, lifeless, into the sea. The waters don't contain Dickie, they contain corpse. They contain Ripley's imitation of Dickie. Just as when Ripley is discovered wearing Dickie's clothes, he takes refuge behind a mirror. His body disappears and presents as a void of dread reflection. He is empty but for the facsimile of Dickie. Then again, at the end of the film, he kills his lover at sea on a ship. Ripley's only lover is the ripples on water, thus the name, I guess. The unstable reflection on the surface of liquid. So let's extract a few insights here. Ripley becomes romantically attracted to what he admires and wants to be like, to become. The tendency in the shapeshifter psychology is to make no distinction between wanting to be with someone and wanting to become someone. Water represents the unstable psyche that can take the form of any container, Ripley's ability to imitate others. This unstable psyche is the place of death. The unstable mind of the shapeshifter ends up causing harm to those he wants to be with, wants to become, and even, in spite of himself, wants to replace. Erotic attraction becomes predatory and parasitic. As a moral of the story, if we have no stable self, no solid ground and personality, we will fail in properly relating to others. You have to be someone to be with someone. The Talented Mr. Ripley is not the story of Heracles overcoming Proteus, but of Narcissus succeeding only in uniting with his own watery reflection, kissing himself in the water and drowning as a result. Saltburn presents a fully villainous version of this. We have a seeming underdog called Oliver who insinuates himself into the life of a wealthy student called Felix, eventually murdering him. He kills or tries to suicide the entire family, becoming sole heir and inhabitor of their large estate. At one point, we see him climb into the bath after the character that he's wanting to imitate has left and absorbing the waters that are left there, and this is symbolic of the parasitic shapeshifter absorbing the identity of its host. This illustrates the parodic nature of the shapeshifter's effeminacy. It's not feminine receptivity, but absorption and replacement of the host. And just as the Talented Mr. Ripley includes towards its end a suffocating of the feminine voice, there's a particular aggression reserved for the mother in Saltburn. Family, both existent and in terms of the relationships that could lead to family, are the main impediment of the shapeshifter in accessing that which it wants. Bizarrely, before his perversions were fully known, the Vanity Fair article about Epstein compared him to Ripley. Indeed, Epstein is a shapeshifter type. Granted, Epstein didn't have multiple personae, and his erotic predation is less about parasitically absorbing that which he admires than it is about feeling powerful and demeaning. But his milieu does seem to express its sense of superiority with respect to established norms by playing with forms in transgressive ways. And this is part of the shapeshifter psychology, we could say. The traditional understanding of erotic attraction is that it indicates the correspondence of forms. Eros is principally about the attraction between fitting or corresponding shapes in this traditional conception. But if the shapeshifter does not identify with his own shape, he has no basis for loving one thing over another. Eventually, he will come to realize that his desire to be with a thing has eroded to the point of being no different from his desire to be that thing. If we no longer believe in form, erotic attraction loses the function of fitting correspondent forms. A being that rejects having any essential form does not essentially correspond to any other. Erotic attraction is unmoored from our form and becomes a free-floating instinct which may attach itself to any object. What meaning could there be in wanting to be with a definite specific person when I am not a person with definite specific attributes? On what basis can the shapeshifter limit its love to a person or distinguish it from the love it may have for every other person, even potentially, when he has no limits, no particular character left inside him? So then, the desire to take on a form and the erotic attraction to that form become conflated. Erotic fixation becomes a proxy for admiration. It does constitute a fundamentally onanistic eros. So the hyper-individual incorporates that which he or she desires and does not seek it outside, does not form grander units that are stable over time. The shapeshifter has no stable self, therefore does not interact with others in terms of specific features, and produces hyper-individualism and collectivism both. Another example of the triumph of the shapeshifter may be sought in Woody Allen's 1983 Zelig, who becomes culture hero and ultimately prospers.
With the doctors watching, Zelig becomes a perfect psychiatrist. When two Frenchmen are brought in, Zelig assumes their characters and speaks reasonable French. In the company of a Chinese person, he begins to develop Oriental features. By now, word has gotten out to the press, and the public, thirsting for thrills and novelty, is immediately captivated. There were not only Leonard Zelig pens and Lucky Charms, but clocks and toys. There were Leonard Zelig watches and books, and a famous Leonard Zelig doll. There were many popular songs inspired by Leonard Zelig, tunes that swept the nation.
Everybody go chameleon, flying in the air chameleon, growing in your head chameleon.
Leonard the lizard, see him running across the floor, see him skittering out the door.
You have such reptile eyes like a lizard that weaves their spell.
Zelig presents us with a shapeshifter whose choice of form is dictated purely by circumstance. If the other two, Ripley and Saltburn's Oliver, are agents of power and of their own desire, Zelig, despite hiding the perversity that such a character would necessarily cultivate in himself, makes an interesting point that such a being, the shapeshifter, will ultimately tend to collapse in on himself given his lack of center. That his shapeshifting will ultimately work by osmosis, which is the shapeshifter not as an agent of power, but as a subject of power, to pursue the fluidity of self out of a desire to become the other, to the point of exerting murderous power over the other, results in a weakened subject, so weak as to be fully determined by context. The shapeshifter necessarily transitions from exerting power to having power exerted upon it, a person able to live whatever life is presented to it, to adopt the culture of whoever happens to get moved in next door, is a fitting hero in an age in which inherited identities are considered an impediment to the market, an impediment to individual self-definition, etc. We get shapeshifters in biblical demonology as well, specifically in the book of Enoch. Without getting into the details, these follow from the improper union of human women with fallen angels, and sure enough, the shapeshifter is symbolically the result of a confusion of planes, a higher and a lower, angelic and human. The human psyche thinks itself universal, abstract, and so able to contain or to become every form. If there is a higher truth and essential unity shared by all individuals, irrespective of their particular form, then why shouldn't the individual manifest all forms in himself, as himself? That's the mistake. I've quoted this in a video before, but I think it's a great description of the mistake that's being made here. This is from Charles Upton. Quote, "The identification of one's consciousness with a vast array of other types of consciousness is a mark of psychic dissolution. In other words, it's not a genuine universality, it's a confusion of forms, ascribing the universal to your psyche or to your body and trying to bring every possible form into yourself, trying to inhabit every possible form, instead of realizing the essence that all those forms have in common.